Hello everybody, my name is Dr. Bill Sutton and I'm an Associate Professor of Wildlife Ecology at Tennessee State University in the Department of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences. In addition to my interest in wildlife ecology, I also have broad interests in wetlands ecology and management. And one of the advantages of working at Tennessee State University is having a large wetland complex that occurs directly adjacent to our immediate campus and also our agricultural research farm. And to give you an idea what this place looks like here, we have a very large wetland complex that is approximately 30 acres. Like I mentioned, it occurs adjacent to our campus and also adjacent to our campus research farm, which provides students a variety of opportunities to understand not only how wetlands function, but also what the impacts of human-based disturbances are on these ecosystems. And for those who may not be aware, wetlands provide a variety of services, including things like floodwater retention, which is important during large stormwater runoff events. And so wetlands immediately catch water that runs into the main basin and prevents direct runoff of water into kind of the larger river systems, which immediately prevents large kind of floodwater fluctuations. And in addition to actually catching the floodwater, wetlands are important for also catching things like stormwater runoff, which can include a variety of contaminants, including things like fertilizers, pesticides, and also things like heavy metals. And so wetlands can also serve as almost a filtration service for water. And in addition to the kind of filtration of a lot of these contaminants, wetlands also provide or contain a variety of microbes that convert a lot of these things like fertilizers and also things like other contaminants into a variety of less harmful forms. One example being nitrate fertilizers, which are converted into nitrogen gas by a process known as denitrification. And in addition to these kind of major kind of functions that wetlands provide, they also provide habitat for a variety of wetland-dependent wildlife and also plant species that have adapted to the either fully wet conditions or the gradient of moisture that occurs across these ecosystems. Now, to talk briefly about some of the different vegetation types we may see at a wetland, one of the important things to consider about wetland ecosystems is that they represent a gradient of conditions instead of actually a fully wet set of conditions, what we might think about a wetland. Wetlands actually provide a transition zone between dry upland areas, kind of the sort of what we would say the semi-wet conditions at the periphery, to the main body of the wetland, which represents more of the permanent wet conditions. And as one might imagine, the organisms that live in these habitats have to be able to adapt to these wet conditions. And plant species have specialized across these gradients to either kind of adapt to these fully wet conditions, which in the situation that plants species that have adapted to the fully wet conditions are what are known as obligate plant species, all the way across to the kind of the semi-wet zones that represent the periphery of the wetland, all the way up into the upland. And so we can use the variety of plant species that we see in the wetland to classify the different zones of the wetland based on the hydrological or water tolerances of these plants. And so to give you all kind of a sample of what we have here in our campus wetland, if we look here, we see a very common plant species we see in a lot of wet zones. These are what are known as cattails. Cattails are a primary wetland indicator and represent what I was talking about of being an obligate plant species, meaning that they have to be in fully wet conditions. Now, if we look down, we also see things like black willow, which is also a riparian or a kind of edge of a flowing water or wetland zone inhabitant. And it's likely a plant species that's a little bit more facultative, meaning that it can stand a little bit more drier conditions than things like cattails. If we look down here, we have plant species, things like smartweed, which is in the genus Polygonum. They're a little bit more tolerant of the wet zones and tend to be found in kind of the peripheral zones or right at the edge of the water. If we look down here, we see common rush, which is a wetland adaptive species, probably more on the obligate side of their water tolerances, which indicates that they have to have wet zones. Now, if we take a look over here, we also see another smartweed plant that has a little inhabitant that's using this structure right now. This is a green tree frog, Hylas cinerea. This is a very small individual, probably one that's metamorphed from a tadpole here recently. And this represents one of the amphibian species that we do see on our campus wetland. One of the questions that I normally ask my students each year in my class is how many wetlands do you think exist in this large complex? And normally students will say about one wetland. Well, we can see from the variety of habitats, including things like emergent, open water, and also forested habitats, we have a variety of different habitat and habitat structures for the species that live here. And there's a habitat condition index known as the Cowardin Habitat or Wetland Classification Scheme used by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service that helps us classify wetlands based on habitats. And we can see that our wetland provides a variety of habitat, which is really important for the variety of plant and wildlife species that live in this ecosystem. Now, one thing I mentioned earlier is the importance of how our wetland occurs adjacent to our campus farm. which provides us opportunities to be able to look at the impacts of agricultural runoff and also livestock on our wetland. And as you can see, we have a herd of goats located right back here that have somewhat direct access to our wetland. And some of the things we can think about of being able to prevent some of the access of livestock to these wetlands are including things like fencing and also buffer zones that prevent runoff from coming in the wetland, which is extremely important. And for landowners, one of the agencies known as the Natural Resource Conservation Service can provide things like conservation easements and other services that can help you manage not only your agricultural zones, but also your immediate wetland ecosystems that may occur on your land. Thanks for your attention, and I appreciate your participation in my small seminar on the wetland.